Well, thank you, Wendy, and also thank you to the U.S. Census Bureau for hosting today's webinar. And also good afternoon to everyone that's joining us. I'm Renee Caloris. I'm with the IT Modernization team with the State Department, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, or DDTC. As many of you probably already know, DDTC's main mission is to ensure that commercial exports of defense services and articles advance U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. And so today we'll have my colleagues will run through the webinar on commodity jurisdictions. So joining me is John Shove, who's a technology jurisdiction analyst responsible for commodity jurisdiction reviews, and also Charlie Liebertraut and Chris Radcliffe, also on the IT modernization team. And then Chris, you could go to the next slide. And so just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. So John will start off with an intro on CJs, and he'll provide some insights and best practices on CJ submissions. Chris will walk us through the CJ form and DECCS, also providing us some additional insights, also going through the CJ statuses. And Charlie will round us out with announcements and reminders on the DECCS system. I think, as Wendy said, please feel free throughout the entire webinar to put as many questions as possible in the chat, comments, because at the end, we're going to save some time for a Q&A session to answer all your questions. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to John.
Thanks, Renee. I appreciate that. Before I get started, I just want to say a thanks to Lisa, Wendy, Victoria, and everyone else at Census for providing this opportunity for us to sort of expand our audience in terms of discussing the commodity jurisdiction process and the importance that it plays in the realm of export control regulations. Next slide, please. So, today's presentation, we're discussing the commodity jurisdiction. And so then really the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is a commodity jurisdiction? And so the way the CJ process is set up, commodity jurisdiction is a request that you can submit to the Department of State to assess whether a commodity, and that commodity can be an actual commodity, it can be the information, or it can be service, and to assess whether or not any of those are covered by the United States munitions list, and thereby subject to the jurisdiction of the Department of State, which administers the international traffic and arms regulations. So just a quick pause before we sort of take a deep dive into all of this. It's important to understand that there are various regulations administered by various agencies that have all been empowered by Congress and delegated authority by the President to maintain a control of export control related items. And all those regulations have a varying degree and a varying level of control. Today's presentation will be discussing the ITAR, specifically the USML, and how that particularly plays out in the commodity jurisdiction process. So really the CJ process itself is the CJ process, we advocate and we propose to industry many times, best practice is a self-classification for an item. And we see industry conducting this on a regular basis. The CJ procedure and CJ process should be one of those procedures reserved for if you're unsure that of the export jurisdiction of that commodity or service, after you've sort of conducted your own internal order of review and your analysis of the export control classification with that particular commodity. We're not going to really go into too much detail about the order of review, but suffice it to say that if you have any questions and you're unclear about the classification and jurisdiction of your item, you are always encouraged to submit a CJ. So a little sort of backup about the CJ process itself, and my colleague Chris is going to take a very deep dive into the actual form and go over all the different blocks and the importance that all of them have. But before we get there, it's important to understand how the CJ process initiates and how it's managed. And the CJ process is an online application. It's all conducted through our DECCS platform. That's the Defense Export Control and Classification System. This is a proprietary software run by Department of State. In addition to managing the CJ platform, it also manages various other platforms that we for the services that we provide for industry. And it's important. It is interesting and important to note that the CJ is quite distinct and different versus the other applications, and that anyone may enroll in DECCS to submit a CJ, and that can be most of the times we see that as being related to U.S. companies, U.S. corporations, U.S. individuals, but the CJ DECCS platform is not limited to just U.S. individuals. And so we also encourage and have seen many times CJs submitted by foreign companies and foreign entities. And so a good example would be a German manufacturer. And in a particular scenario, let's say the German manufacturer, the assumption is that they would know and be familiar with their own German export control regulations and be in compliance with those regulations. However, there's no expectation that they would be familiar with or have an in-depth understanding of United States regulations. And so let's say the scenario of a German exporter who wishes to temporarily import a defense article into the United States. Once they've conducted their order of review, they might not necessarily understand our regulations, might not necessarily be comfortable with that self-classification. And so it's quite feasible that they could file a CJ request on their behalf and ask us for an official determination to assess whether that defense article is described on the USML and what the appropriate USML category would be. So in addition to building this the DECCS platform, we took into consideration a lot of feedback and interests relating to industry as a whole. And so we try to make it sort of a fair playground for everybody. And major corporations, multi-billion-dollar conglomerates can file CJs, but even individual mom and pops, or starting a new business in their garage or in their basement, even they can file a CJ with us. And each one is given the exact same weight in case management and analysis. And what we try to build in the DECCS platform is this sort of transparency between Department of State and those applicants. And so we built the DECCS system to be this sort of communication to a platform, but also we built it sort of an easy case management tool for industry, so that as industry submits these CJ requests, each file becomes its own individual case. All the information related to that case is centrally located, all the supporting documents are centrally located, and even our final determination letter that we issue upon complete review of the case is uploaded into the case file and creates a central repository for industry. So we try to take into consideration user interface, accessibility of the system, and how best to apply it to all members and all applicants. So with that, and sort of before we dive into the CJ process, it's important to sort of understand that there are some best practices that we advocate for industry, and some pitfalls that we like to advise against. And so the 7 that we see here on this slide is just that. These are just some of the top items that we see and best practices and pitfalls to avoid. The first one specifically relates to USML Category 21. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the USML, it's actually broken up into 21 categories. And each one has its own separate subheadings, and each relates to a specific type of commodity. So we control armored vehicles, we control ballistic vests, we control night vision devices, fire control systems. And the intent of the USML and through the order of review is that each item is classified under the USML under a specific USML category. USML Category 21 is separate in that regard, in that USML Category 1 is not a catch-all paragraph. It's not a catch-all commodity classification. It is a specific category that we use to denote those items that are new, developing technologies or developing commodities that we feel warrant control on the USML, but aren't currently listed on the USML. And so Category 21 is a placeholder where we can classify them, place them under there, until such time as we can actually revise the USML to specifically enumerate those items on the USML. So my recommendation is to never self-classify under USML Category 21, nor use USML Category 21 with relation to export control documentation. This has a lot of confusion and isn't the best classification for those items. Another best practice that we sort of advocate for the CJ process and the CJ application itself is to tell us a story. You know, some of us have backgrounds, or some of us have various backgrounds, some of us have technical backgrounds, some of my fellow TJ analysts have legal backgrounds. And what's important for conducting that CJ review is understanding the entirety of the commodity, how it was developed, when it was developed, what kind of funding, you know, where it is in a stage in that process of development, any sales information. So we're really looking for that story to tie everything together so we have a better picture of what exactly it is that we're being asked to review so we can better provide an appropriate response to the request submitted. When it comes to actual CJ, and I think Chris will discover that, just be discussing this a little bit further in the presentation. When it comes to use of NA, we ask to use that sparingly and really only indicate where the lack of information may result in an RWA. An RWA is a return without action. We issue these many times when there is insufficient information in the case file or incomplete information, and we don't have the full picture in the actual application. Again, file a CJ whenever there is doubt on the jurisdictional classification. If you have any questions about the CJ process, the application process, you can always reach out to our response team at DDTC. They are excellent at providing responses to industry and helpful tools and tips. And note that there's a difference between a CJ and an advisory opinion. This is another major pitfall that we see from industry as a whole. An advisory opinion is just that. It's an opinion that we issue at DDTC that provides clarity or insight into how we would interpret a specific section or a specific paragraph within the ITAR. It is a non-binding document and has no legal authority. It's just simply an opinion. And that's different from a CJ because a CJ is a specific request to a classification request. And those letters that we issue, those jurisdictional determinations that we issue, those are legal binding documents that you can take to whatever proceedings or whatever proof or whatever support you need as it relates to whether exporting the item, licensing the item, or building your internal compliance program as it relates to that classification. Also, it's important to note that there are two audiences to any CJ request. First, we're looking at, again, the technical side of the commodity, what it is, what it's capable of, what's its function, what's its performance, right? We need to know the details and nuances of that commodity so that we have a full picture of how we best classify it. Also, the other review, the other audience to that request is the regulatory audience, myself, my other fellow TGA and CJ analysts. Right? We are reviewing the commodity as it exists and comparing it to the regulations to make that determination. And so we ask that when you submit a CJ, always sort of take into consideration what the item is, what it's capable of, and how you think or how you best suggest, based on your self-classification, how that item would be described on the USML. And then lastly, when it comes to third-party submissions, and I think Chris will be going over that in much more detail later, whenever it comes to any third-party submission, an OEM letter is required, and the lack of an OEM letter will result in a return without action, an RWA. So with that, I will turn that back over to Chris and ask that he provide us with that wonderful, detailed walkthrough of the CJ form.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. And that was a wonderful introduction to the broad application for CJs, what they're for, why DDTC employs them as a service offered. Now, like John just mentioned, we're going to walk through the CJ form as it is in DECCS. We're going to be going through a lot of the functionality of the form, as well as certain areas to maybe look out for certain information. And we'll be kind of going through that form with John, also guiding us in certain areas to say, keep a lookout for, that spot. Be sure to add the important critical information there. Pay special attention to this field. So let's get started. As we've done in previous webinars, we showed the dashboard, the main hub of where that application lives. So the DS 4076, excuse me, the CJ form, the commodity jurisdiction form, lives on the CJ request launching pad. This is the home page for CJs. And to get started with your CJ request, you'll click Start a new CJ request down at the bottom. It's that blue button. That'll immediately take you into a new CJ form. A couple of things to note right off the bat. Up at the top, the blue ribbon, similar features and functionality as other forms within DECCS. You have the exit button as well as the help button. Exit will take you back to that main CJ dashboard, and clicking help will give you a little bit of context and assistance on the current page that you're reviewing. So utilize that help feature whenever necessary. Over on the left, you'll notice that we're starting off on block 1.1 filer information. It's the filer type. You'll also notice that the registered with PM DDTC box is already checked and it's grayed out. That's because the system recognizes that my account has that I'm actively registered with DDTC. So that checkbox, if you are registered with DDTC, will come auto-checked. Continuing through that form, you'll use the drop-down for company as well as registration code to select your company name and your registration code. We've blurred out part of the registration code just for security purposes. But in doing so, in choosing those two things from the drop-down, part of this form, of this page, will self-populate with some information. You'll then still have to go through and select your filer type, whether it be exporter, foreign government, manufacturer, manufacturer's representative. The selections we've made here on this page are actually a little unique, and let me explain why. We chose manufacturer as well as other because when you select other, you'll notice right below the filer type field that an other explanation field opens, and you'll have to give some context as to why you're choosing other. But in addition, if you select manufacturer as your filer type, you'll notice on the left side of the screen, block 1.2 OEM, I have an arrow denoting it. That field actually only appears, the original equipment manufacturer field only appears if you select a filer type other than manufacturer. So since we selected manufacturer and other, that field appears, and later on in the form, we're going to be expected to add in information about the original equipment manufacturers to the commodity in question. And so continuing through this form, you'll include information such as the address, city, location, relevant information. And just before we pass block 1.1, you'll notice on the left side, all of the blocks are grayed out. And that's because the CJ form hasn't actually been generated in DECCS yet. To generate that form and to have that be an active draft CJ form, you'll actually have to click save on the first page. And in doing so, it'll generate the draft CJ submission in the system and allow you to press continue and move forward onto future blocks. So let's do that. Moving past the filer type block, we have the filer points of contact. And this is similar to other features within DECCS or other point of contact when you're filling out relevant applications. You click add new POC, and then that'll open up a box which will prompt you to put the first name, last name, telephone, and email address of that POC. Once you click save POC, down on the bottom right of the screen, we see that there's a small little card that denotes that that POC has been saved, and that will be on this page moving forward. For block 1.2, still continuing on that train because there are about five sub-blocks within block 1. We now find ourselves at the filer technical points of contact page. The functionality is the same as the previous block, only the purpose of the technical POC is a bit different than the filer POC. This is going to be the individual that CJA analysts, that the TJA team reaches out to if they have questions about the technical aspects of this commodity. And it's really useful because, as John mentioned, you have people from all walks of life in the CJ office. You have lawyers, you have engineers, individuals who review these applications and have different specialties. So if they need to reach out about certain aspects of this commodity, technical aspects, this would be the individual that they would reach out to. And so moving forward, we find ourselves now on block still on block 1, but on the OEM field. The information and functionality on this page is the same, but it is important to fill out the the original equipment manufacturer, because this is another individual that the CJ team is going to reach out to if they have questions on this commodity. But fill out the company, organization name, their address, and other location relevant information, and you'll find yourself going through this part very quickly. And then the last part of block 1, the third party field. Not everybody who's submitting a CJ is going to have third party information to fill. In doing so, you're able to click continue and skip past this if you don't have any third party information to add. But if you do, check the box that says enter third party info, and then you'll get fields that look identical to the ones we just reviewed within the OEM block. A difference between the OEM block and this would be that this is the third party's contact information. Potentially a law firm is helping out an entity or a company complete applications within DECCS, and that third party would that's where they would be listed here. We have some sample information listed in the expanded fields right there that indicate we have a law firm helping us. But John, I think that this is a good spot to pause really quick and ask you, while those fields are relatively simple and straightforward, what are some of the things that CJ analysts kind of stress about this first portion of the CJ form?
Sure. The one thing that we try to stress in this particular application is, again, sort of tied back into the CJ form being that tell us a story. And so, not only are we asking you to tell us a story about the development of the commodity and the product, we're also asking you to provide us a story of the interested parties. And so when it comes to the OEM, a simple CJ request will be filed by the OEM, in which case the OEM simply inputs their information as both the applicant and as well as the OEM, and then fills out the form and submits the information directly to us. That's the simplest version that we see of a CJ form. Some of the more complex ones, like you mentioned, are third-party submission. And so if I were to go back to the example I provided before about the German manufacturer, it could be a scenario where a German manufacturer wants to, sell the item, have it imported in the United States, but it could be the importer who's actually purchasing it from the German company, and it's the importer who wants to import that particular item. And let's say then that the importer, they themselves are not very keen or savvy to the CJ process, and so they then hire a law firm, like you had mentioned. And so it's important that we understand all the parties to the transaction, because it helps us paint the picture of what exactly is transpiring here and who all the vested interest parties are. Part of this is a requirement that, there's a due diligence that we have to perform. And there is a legal requirement to make sure that OEMs are aware of any proceedings that we are conducting on their behalf. And so that's why it's so crucial that CJs, if they're filed as other than the OEM, as a third-party submission, that OEM letter is provided. Because what that does is that gives us the authority and the acknowledgement that the OEM is aware that there is a CJ being processed on behalf of their commodity, which they own, but is being conducted by a third party. And so it's just a very technical due diligence legal requirement that all parties are involved in the transaction and know the transaction. And the information provided in here tells us that story and provides us that relevant information if we have any concerns or need to follow up on anything.
Definitely. Thanks for that really great description. And so moving forward, we've left block 1 now, and we're on to the beginning of some of the other information within the CJ form. Block 2 refers to the determination type. And you'll see here that there are 3 different determination types. The first of which is new submission. We have resubmission, and a CJ that's related to a US government request. And so in selecting new submission, there will not be any further questions on this page or fields to fill out, so you're simply able to continue through this form. With a resubmission, you are then expected to add the prior CJ case number. That's because if it's a resubmission, we're expecting that there was a CJ that was submitted prior. So adding that CJ case number, the prior CJ case number in there, will help CJ analysts kind of connect those 2 pieces. As well as a reason for the resubmission. Now, it could have been RWA'd. There could be a reconsideration of additional information provided. or it could be a redesignation of an article currently covered by the USML. Regardless of the reason for resubmission, immediately after that, the field will ask for the user to summarize that reason for resubmission, whether it is RWA because maybe a piece of information was missing in the previous CJ. That is how you would go about summarizing that, maybe the reasons behind that RWA and then what has changed in this application so far. But once you've made your CJ determination type, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. The last type of determination type is if it's related to a US government request. If so, the user will then be expected to put the disclosure or case number, as well as list the agency that requested this CJ. If this is a US government agency request, that means that there is an individual who the user has been contacting with or liaisoning a bit with over email or in the system. So you're then expected to add a US government point of contact afterward. Adding that POC is the same as adding the technical or the filer POC. You'd click Add New USG POC, and then it would open the field up where you could enter the first, last name, the telephone number, and the email of that individual who DDTC can correlate with. Block 3 refers to the service type of the commodity. We see selections immediately right off the bat, like end item, service, component, or major. And if in filling out the CJ request, you're unsure of any of the selections on this page, we have useful little eye icons next to certain areas within the CJ form, as well as other forms within DECCS, that give a little bit more context and rationale behind what those exact word choices mean. You'll also then notice that if you select Other as a service type, you'll be prompted to explain that selection. There will be a field that opens up down below. So John, I know that this block is kind of seen as maybe the scope of the CJ request, and in turn kind of defines the parameters for how the CJ team reviews this request or reviews the commodity. Could you speak to that a little bit more, maybe just the importance of this block?
Sure. Yeah, it's important to understand both what you had mentioned. All the items on here except for Other are defined in the ITAR. And so if anybody has a question and what those blocks mean, we can always refer to the pop-up, or they can refer to the specific definition in the ITAR. What's really crucial for this particular block here is selecting the blocks indicates to us what you had mentioned, the scope of the CJ. So if it's if it is an end item, the analysis will be on that end item, and jurisdiction classification that we issue in our final determination will reflect that. If you are requesting that you want us to review both the end item, but let's say there's a service that you're providing that's relating to that end item, and you want to know the classification of the service, then you would select service block. Again, or in addition, you could ask for information, whether or not information directly related to that particular that particular end item system is also or would be also described on USML. So every block that's selected requires its own separate analysis, and we go through that for each one. And so the final determination letter, when we say that this is important, is because this frames how that final letter will appear in the analysis that we conduct. We will give you a determination for each block that you select in that final letter. Most people usually select only one or two because it's a specific type of request. But just note that if at any point in time after the CJ has been submitted and it's through discussions with the applicant or the OEM that we're expanding the original scope of this request to include something that wasn't originally indicated in this block, that will significantly delay the CJ process because we have to then go back to the original case, do a separate analysis, and then staff that through an industry review accordingly. So it's really important, really crucial to get this block correct right out the gate.
Definitely, and that is probably a huge reason why we have these really descriptive paragraphs that even lead it back to certain sections of the ITAR for people's reference.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Moving forward onto block 4, this is where we can enter some basic information about our commodity or service. Since this is a CJ request and the CJ requests pertain to commodities, one commodity is required to be entered here. So in doing so, clicking Add Commodity expands a section to add information about that commodity broken up into two distinct sections. The first is Section A, and that includes information such as the commodity name or the product name, as well as the general description, model, and part number. And then in Section B, it asks for information such as the stock number, military intelligence specification, patent information, and cost per unit. For Section A, it refers to information released in Block 13, and Section B refers to information not released in Block 13. We will proceed throughout the form and get to Block 13 a bit later and reference back so that we understand exactly how this information connects. But notice at the bottom of Section B, it asks for the user to explain if any of this is restricted for public release by the US government. John, really quick, do you want to touch upon why we list that here in this block and not in Block 13, or maybe how the explanation here in this block impacts a CJ analyst or the government's perspective of like what can be released from the CJ request?
Sure. The big key that we're trying to accomplish here is, we're cognizant that the CJ form is just like any other form where we are soliciting information from industry, and we understand that most of the information provided in the CJ form is business proprietary information. And so our goal throughout the CJ process is to protect the interests of those businesses and protect that business, that BPI. The purpose for Block 4A and 4B is to distinguish which information, if the applicant were to allow us, that we could then make public. And the reason that we do that is in part good governance and best practices. What we try to do is publish our CJ determinations online to provide those as resources for industry so that they have questions about a particular commodity or a particular USML category. They could go to our CJ determinations and review those final determination letters. It's to get some input into sort of our rationale or sort of our thinking in terms of interpretations of a CJ. And so, we want to be careful what information that we release, but we also want to make sure that the applicant is aware that that information may be released, but only under the authority that they give us.
Definitely. All right, thank you for that. Moving forward, we next have the detailed description section for the commodity or service. What you're going to want to do here and what DDTC is looking for in this field is for the user, for the customer really, to give a detailed description of this commodity. And you'll notice that it says at a minimum, please describe what it does, how it operates, the components or the systems that are used within it, and identify the end use platform. Really, you're going to want to type as much as you can about this commodity or give as much of a description as possible. And you will notice that there's a 4,000 character limit. If your commodity does take more of an explanation than the characters allotted and provided within this field, feel free to attach additional information about this commodity as a supporting document later on in the form. We see that block 15 down there, we will get to it and I'll show you what that looks like, but block 15 is the supporting documents field. That's where you're going to be adding additional supporting documents to help back up any of the areas within your CJ that could use a little bit of bolstering. So moving past block 5, we then find ourselves at the characteristics and capabilities of the commodity. Choices in this field are ballistic protection, chemical biological weapons, civil applications. And while there isn't any eye icon to help users kind of get a better sense and idea of what these characteristics and capabilities are defined as, it's more of a self-classification in a sense, that when you're going through this form, if you work with Tempest capabilities for this commodity in question, for instance, you would tend to know that that commodity then does have characteristics that are similar or at least relate to Tempest capabilities. And As always, throughout this form, we've seen DDTC does like to ask for explanations for certain selections. So any selection made on this page of any characteristics or capabilities will require a corresponding explanation behind that selection. So moving past block 6, we find ourselves at the commodity origin block. This is an area within the CJ that attempts to uncover the commodity's origin, as well as its developmental relationship with other commodities and USML enumerations. We do see that initially I wanted to show the functionality of this page by selecting no to all of the questions, but if we select yes to any of those questions, a corresponding explanation field will open. Continuing on this same block, further down on the same block, we have a section that questions whether the commodity has the same function and performance capabilities as other commodities. And so in selecting yes to any of the questions in that 3 group, same function, same performance capabilities, will require the user and the customer to add a new like commodity. Similarly, if the user answers yes to if there are identical or comparable products through foreign means, you'll have to add a like commodity for that as well. And once you click add like commodity, there will be a field on the right side, that expands on the screen. We have that listed here right on the right side that asks for information such as the manufacturer, commodity, model number, part number, as well as an explanation or description behind why this selection is being made. Once you finish, click Save Like Commodity, and then you're able to move through this block. Awesome. So we have now reached the product development stage of the CJ request, where DDTC asks what the development stage of this commodity is in. You'll have selections such as proposal or concept, blueprint design, design complete, all the way down to design complete, and there have been active sales for this commodity. If other is selected, you will have to give an explanation and provide an explanation as to why other was chosen and why any of those selections on the list didn't meet the criteria for that commodity. An interesting thing to note on this page, though, that is rather important to remember, is if you're submitting a commodity jurisdictions for a commodity, and let's say you submitted a CJ for that commodity and it was in the proposal or concept stage. Well, if that commodity then is in the design complete sales stage a year or 2 later, the determination made on that commodity originally when it was in the proposal concept stage will no longer apply to the commodity once it's in its design complete sales stage, because the USML classification or the determination made on that commodity has changed. There's been new information added into the mix that needs to be further reviewed to ensure that it's classified under the USML correctly. Moving past block 8, you'll find yourself at funding history. Now, we've selected self-funded on the initial screenshot just to show in the system that if you do select self-funded, you will not be prompted to add an additional explanation, but rather you'll be able to continue through the form. Making any other selection other than self-funded, for instance, on the left we see U.S. government agency, you'll have to provide some context behind that. You'll have to identify which agency funded your item, as well as some dates for the funding authorizations, and that's for U.S. government particularly. And then on the right side, we just wanted to show that you can select multiple selections in this block. Foreign government agency, university funded, U.S. foreign contractor. All of these fields are dynamic so that when you make these selections, when you check that box, the corresponding explanation field will open. On block 10, this refers to sales information for the commodity. If there have not been any sales in the past 5 years, either for military or commercial, you'll have to provide an explanation behind that. If selected yes, you'll have to add sales information for those distinctions, military and commercial sales. Adding a new sale looks a little bit like this, where you'll have to include the sales type, the purchaser, country, model number, end use, and some other information about that commodity as it pertains to that sale. It is important to note, though, that similarly to the detailed description for the commodity, if you find yourself either running out of room, or you have too many sales to enter, because for some larger companies, you have hundreds of sales listed for certain commodities, if not thousands. You are required to enter at least one sale into the system to meet the requirements for DECCS, for the DECCS system. But then additionally, you're able to attach, we at DDTC encourage you to attach the sales information, whether it be in Excel or however you have that information, as a supporting document to save you some time, and recognize that maybe some of those steps are a little tedious with attaching or with entering every single individual sale. You're able to upload sales information as a supporting document to help bolster this field a little bit. On to block 11 for the export and classification info. If the commodity has not been exported, and if it's not been subject to a Department of Commerce request, you answer no, and you'll be able to move through this block easily. But if the answer is yes, you'll be expected to provide the export history for that commodity, as well as any relevant license numbers that correlate to that exporting history. By clicking Add License, it adds a license number field like that there, and just know that that field is, you're able to enter multiple licenses. So clicking Add License again will add another license number field. We see that down there with the Foreign Military Sales case, the FMS case number, if you will. I've added 2 of those fields just to show the functionality that multiple can be entered, and that to delete one, you click the X next to that field number, or next to the field. In addition, if it was exported as a part of an FMS case, you'll have to add that FMS case number similar to the license information. And so moving past block 11, you then find yourself at the reason for the CJ request. Similar to the detailed description for the commodity, while that field was interested in learning about the commodity specifically, this block is interested in collecting information about the CJ request in general. So provide an explanation for why the CJ request is being submitted. And then a useful part of this block that CJ analysts definitely consider and review is suggested classifications. For instance, we ask under the explanation field, and it's not required, but if applicable, to suggest a USML category for that commodity. In addition, we ask for the rationale of those recommended classifications. And this kind of helps the CJ analyst get an initial understanding of how the company or manufacturer views this commodity to be classified or designated under the USML. Moving forward to block 13, the publication block, if you will, of the CJ request. This is where the individual will be able to offer the right to DDTC for them to be able to publish the determination and findings of this CJ request. John, I want to pass it back over to you really quick, just to kind of help bridge that gap between what we saw on block 4 to what we're seeing now on block 13 with reference to the publication.
Sure. What we were particularly looking at in the publication, again, ties back into what we saw in block 4. And so, this is a belts and suspenders. This is a, dot our I and cross our T scenario where we are making confirmation that the applicant is still okay and gives us permission to publish the information within their file. But if you'll note from the language provided in a specific block, it only denotes the information that's provided in block 4A. So again, though we are giving authorization to publish information, the only information we are publishing is that specific information provided in public in part 4A, which is really general marketing information, make, model, and part number. We don't release BPI, we don't release prices, we don't release sales data, we don't release anything like that. That's all BPI. The typical information you see in block 4A, which again, we're asking for authorization for publish in block 13, I'm sorry, in block 13, is that information which is already typically in the public domain. Most of the manufacturers publish part numbers, and we already know who the make and model is by the information provided online. So again, just confirming and making sure that the applicant is authorizing us and giving us the proper permissions to make available that specific subset of information to the public.
Great. Thank you so much for that distinction. Moving forward on block 14, we have the other block, which asks for any information that the user or customer wants to provide but wasn't asked for in the rest of the CJ application. This is really one of those catch-all spots where if you have anything left to add, feel free to add it in block 14. And then on block 15, this is a bit of a blown up version of how to attach documents and the supporting documents field within the CJ form. You will notice immediately on the page on the left side, when you enter block 15, there will just be a blue button that says add new supporting document. It'll be the only thing on that field. And in clicking that, it'll allow you to then browse for a file. Clicking browse for a file will open up your file explorer, and you can search through your computer for that file that you know that you need to attach. After attaching it there, add a descriptor for what that file is. Maybe it's the original equipment manufacturer letter. And then give a description of that attachment. It can be a brief description. Once you've saved that supporting document, continue going forward, adding new supporting documents if you need to. But once you've added your supporting documents, you can click continue. And that brings us to the last block of the CJ form. It's the applicant submitter's certification. The filer will want to enter their signature as well as their title, and then enter the date that the CJ request is going to be submitted on. Once the filer has kind of checked the CJ application for accuracy and made sure that there are no errors or, within the form, they are free to go ahead and click certify and submit. Doing so will then submit it to DDTC. And before I turn it over to Charlie to go over a couple quick things within the DECCS system, I do want to go over a couple of the case statuses that you'll see within DECCS if you're interacting in the CJ system. On the bottom right, you'll notice that we have a blue box. That means that the CJ has been submitted to DDTC, and that in the bottom right, you'll see that there's a View RFI Response button. That means that there is an active RFI in association with this CJ request. But you'll notice that there are a ribbon on quite a few of the statuses we have here versus the bottom right box that does not have a ribbon. If the box does have a ribbon, that means that that DDTC is awaiting an action by the user, that the customer in the system has an action to take. The orange CJ status means that there's an active RFI that the customer needs to respond to. You'll also notice that the ribbon is right there over the orange box as well, indicating that there's an action for the customer to take. The red status box means that there is an action for the customer to take, but it's close to being due or past due. Those colors help kind of indicate and just grab people's attention that maybe there's an action that needs to be taken there. And then the green statuses indicate that the CJ has been closed by DDTC, and that the ribbon indicates that the customer can click on that and that there is new information for them to view. Charlie, I think that is all from me, and I would love to turn it over to you to go over some DECCS self-service.
All right. Well, first of all, folks, thanks for hanging with us. And I know we've got bit by the technical issues a little bit at the start here, so we're running a little bit long. Lisa, if we need to stop, please just jump in and stop us. And for those of you guys who can hang with us, we've got a little bit more to go through here. We'll try to get to a couple of questions. But there's a few screens I want everybody to see, because if you have questions, which we won't be able to get to today as we're running out of time, there are ways to still get your question answered. We'll go through them real quick here, Chris. So first of all, just the biggest place to go is if you are already enrolled in DECCS and can access the system. Right here on the industry portal, the first page you'll notice in that large blue box there on the lower right is create a support case. This does not mean only questions about logins and forgotten passwords and I can't save a form. This is everything. So any question that you might have for the group here specific to the CJs, questions we're not getting to, they can also go into those and submit a case. As you're going through, we want to help, so please submit your question there. That is the best way to get information to us. The other place to do that then is also in the upper right. You'll notice there's just a little, it's hard to see, it's a smaller picture there, but specifically says my support cases. You have the option to create one there. And also if there is feedback or information more required from you on a question, it'll indicate it up there as well. So you'll be able to know when an help analyst is looking for feedback from your end. Just a general example here of a breakdown of what the case looks like. Of course, you can kind of click through all of these. These are pretty self-explanatory as a self-service form. Obviously, enter the information that you have to share with us. Every piece of information you provide will get us that much closer to the answer faster. One of the highlights, though, that I did want to point out is the page is dynamic, so options will change as you select options from the dropdowns. And then, Chris, in the next slide, you'll see that there in the short description field also acts as a search. So as you type in your main question, this is the issue I have with the CJ or another topic, the form will do a search on our existing articles and FAQs to try to find you that answer if it's already posted out there somewhere. So if that answer is already available, we encourage you to use that information to get to the answer faster. But if not, then obviously continue to add as much information to the ticket as possible. Continue through, click that little submit button down in the lower right-hand corner, and you will get a page that looks like this, tracking your question. Again, you will get a reference number, as well as a chat feature where you can send direct questions to the analyst supporting the case. So you don't have to send emails back and forth. You don't have to try to submit another case. Once you have one submitted, that chat feature allows you direct communication to the analyst regarding that issue. Okay, blew through that pretty quick. So, and again, if you need more help, there's just another example. If you are not already enrolled in DECCS, on our website, we also have general links to help you connect with us. The help button down at the bottom will get you to our FAQs and contacting us directly without even having to enroll in DECCS. Keep plugging forward, Chris. All right, real quick. A couple of announcements that we did want to share with you folks. The first one being that, as you saw on that previous slide, the website is, we encourage everyone to use that as a first resource. Lots of good information out there on the technical platform that Chris just went through on the tips of how to submit a CJ, like John was talking about earlier. So please go take a look at that. In the next couple of weeks, you should see, for those of you who are familiar with the website, you will see an updated look and feel. We are releasing an updated website to several of our pages, primarily the high traffic pages, trying to give it a little easier usability for folks who are going to be trying to find some information on those pages. So for those of you who are frequent users, you'll notice a little updated look and feel, which will be kind of flashy. So be on the lookout for that. And while you're there, also in the announcements, we wanted to highlight the fact that we have a DECCS user group for 2022. This is a group that we will select around 50 industry users who will participate in sessions with DDTC, specifically on DECCS improvements. We will elicit feedback from this group, make sure that use them for feedback on our updates, making sure that our changes are effective and doing what we expect them to do. So we appreciate a lot of that interaction with industry. So if you are interested in participating with that, that announcement is out on our website as well, right on the front page. Please go ahead and check that out and reply. In addition to all of that, you can see here, I think Wendy and Lisa have posted this in the chat, but also if you have feedback specifically for census on this webinar and the content involved, please use that link as listed there that you see on the screen. Love to hear from you, and we always try to make these as informative as possible, as you can tell from where we are in the time. All right, with all of that, I want to get to at least some questions. So again, thank you guys for hanging in there. I'm going to get through at least some cues here that we can hopefully answer. So John, the big one that started this whole thing off way back when at the beginning of the presentation, I want to ask this of you first, is timing in the response for the CJs. There are some folks that have been saying they've been waiting a while for their response. Is there anything to be done about that? Is there a better way, or is there a standard time frame they should be expecting things? What happens if folks feel like it's taking a while to get an official response?
Sure, and we get this question a lot. Understand that each CJ is reviewed as a case-by-case basis. So depending on the commodity or the information or the service that's being requested for review, and where that item may be described in the USML, that can complicate the analysis depending on certain items as they are controlled in the USML. All items on the USML are controlled for national security reasons, and they're controlled when they warrant a significant military or critical advantage. CJ reviews always have to take that into consideration. And like I said, since these CJs provide that legal determination, we have to make sure that we get it right so that we don't cause any errors or inconsistencies as a result of our determinations. These typical CJs on average understand that with COVID, a lot of the postures within the agencies did transition to a telework scenario, and that did affect some agencies' access to the case files and being able to review and adjudicate those in a timely fashion. We are addressing that, and as with anything else, we are implementing new technologies and new advantages to sort of expedite that process. Along those lines, the types of reviews that are conducted, it's important to understand that a CJ is not specifically, it's not only reviewed by the Department of State. So when CJs are submitted to us, we do a first review of it, and then we staff that out to the other agencies so that they also have an opportunity to provide feedback in response to those. In some instances, CJs can be delayed because there is a disagreement between the agencies and the classification of the item. And so that's where some of these CJs take a little bit longer because it requires additional work by the analysts and by leadership at Department of State and the other agencies to bring everybody to an understanding and that for that final determination.
All right. Makes sense, John. Thank you.
Sure.
And again, sometimes these things are that complicated and take some time, right, to get through.
So yeah, sometimes they just take time. Sometimes they're pretty straightforward, and we clear them out relatively quickly. And like I said, sometimes they just take a while.
Understandable. All right, Chris, I've got one for you because I know if one person has this question, I want to make sure everyone knows the answer. You went through a very long form for CJs. Can you save that mid-submission, or do you have to do it all at once?
No, you can save that at mid-submission. On each block of the CJ form at the bottom, there's going to be a save and a continue button. The only area or place that wouldn't be applicable or potentially might not initially be applicable is on the first block of the CJ form. The continue button will be grayed out until you click save. Also, as you move through the CJ form, clicking continue, advancing through blocks by clicking continue automatically saves the information that was entered on that form, on that block prior. So you either can click save at any point on any page in the CJ form, or click continue to move forward from a block, saving that information retroactively.
Right. Perfect. So yes, we're not that mean. We didn't develop a system where you have to try to do it all within a certain time limit and scramble and have all the information. You absolutely can save and come back. Thank you, Chris. All right, and then John, I think we'll do one more here, John.
Okay.
CJ determination letters, when they're finalized by DDTC, are they available to the public? And if so, where?
So the letters themselves are available to the applicant through the DECCS system as part of our case closeout final determinations. The letters themselves are not generally available to the public, and that is because those letters still contain some personal information relating to the applicant, such as mailing address, phone number, email address, personal information, that kind of thing. So we don't release the letters in their entirety. What we do release to the public is a summary of our findings. And we release that on our website. I think it's in an Excel format, and that provides what we mentioned earlier in terms of Block 4A, which is the the make, model, serial number, or I'm sorry, make, model, part number, and what our specific determination was in that ruling.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes sense. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
And with that, I think, unfortunately, gang, I am going to say we're running way over time at this point. So I know we had a lot of good information to share with you folks. And thank you very much for all of your questions. What I can tell you is that we are collecting all of the questions you guys have entered in the chat today. And we will do our best to make sure that if there are any of those questions that are common, that can be easily answered, that are not already out on our FAQs or in our articles, we will put those into our flow or queue to get out to the website to make sure that those answers are available. As well as we mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation, this will be recorded and made available through Census and through the DDTC website. So look for that in a couple of weeks. The recording will be publicly available. So if you missed anything, if a coworker or partner needed to see some of this information or hear some of this, that will be available for them as well. And with that, I think we will thank everybody for the time. And Wendy or Lisa, I think we are good to go.
Hi there. Can you hear me now? Much better?
There's Wendy.
All
Hey.
right. Yay.
Hi.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the State Department. Great job by everyone. I see in the chat that the presentation was well received. They thanking you all for this great presentation. And thank you to all the participants who endured the technical glitch that we experienced today. So certainly want to thank you for that and look forward to more webinars to come in the future. So just like to say that a lot of great information from John and Chris. We got to learn about best practices as well as an in-depth demo on the deep dive into commodity jurisdiction. So once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.